This is Matthew of Another World Terraria, where I teach and inspire you on the topics of rare plants and artistic nature displays. Welcome to part 4 of the Crown Forest build log. In this video, the final part in the series, I'm going to take you through phases 5 and 6, which include planting the tank and making adjustments to the design and plants over time as it grows in. Really quick, I'd like to give a shout out to everyone who joined my focus group and shared their valuable feedback. You're awesome and I appreciate you. With that said, let's move on to the tank. After several weeks using the AWT mold cycle method explained in the previous video, the woodscape mold bloom started to die back and the design was ready to be planted. Since the clay mixture isn't directly a suitable substrate for the type of plants that I wanted to use, I had to add a layer of sphagnum moss. Here's a view of the tank showing the beds of sphagnum moss tucked between the hardscape. Note that I didn't lay the sphagnum on super thick or cover any large areas of the scape. Instead, I added some little pockets in strategic areas. Obviously, the placement of sphagnum was chosen based on where I wanted to put plants, and that was determined by my vision for how the tank should look when grown in. One thing that might be less obvious is that there is a natural pattern to that placement. That is, the pockets are all in natural depressions in the scape or at the base of key hardscape elements. This does two things. First, it makes it look more natural because plants and moss tend to grow in depressions and at the bases of wood and rocks, and they do that because that's where moisture gathers. And second, by placing the main plantings at those locations, they maintain the visual flow of the composition and even enhance each hardscape element's visual impact within it. The primary plant species is a mini epiphytic fern called Microgramma heterophylla. I chose this plant for a few reasons. First, it was small in comparison to the size of the wood, so it wouldn't overwhelm the hardscape. Second, the low and creeping growth habit and the light and frilly foliage would create the overall effect and texture that I wanted for this design. And third, I had plenty of this species to start with, so I could easily spread it around in a lot of areas of the tank. I pulled small divisions of the fern off the mother colony and planted them in the sphagnum using tweezers for more precision and ease of working in tight spaces. I occasionally misted the plants to keep them hydrated. I continued placing the ferns throughout the tank wherever I thought it looked natural and would create the composition that I envisioned, such as in crevices and on top of the stump. By the way, there are some links in the description for some of the products used in this video in case you want to get any of those things for your own project. One trick I sometimes use to hold plants and sphagnum in place is to make clips out of floral wire. I cut sections of the wire with my trusty side cutter pliers and then bend them into narrow U-shaped clips. You can make them in varying lengths depending on how deep the substrate is and how large the plants are that you need to get around. I then inserted the clips over some of the sphagnum to hold it in place. Then I laid the plants down and gently secured them in place with more clips, being careful not to put too much pressure on them. The clip method is especially useful on vertical surfaces. I put a tiny piece of sphagnum around the fern rhizome and then place a clip around it. I carefully put everything in place with tweezers until it was loosely where I wanted it, and then used my fingers to gently force the clip into the substrate, which secured the sphagnum and the plant in position. This technique works extremely well on foam backgrounds. I wanted some fern to grow up the stump branches, so I used a tiny amount of superglue to attach the rhizome and hold the fern in position until its roots could grab on. Here's a photo of the right side of the tank after planting the microgramma. Notice that the plants follow the natural flow of the composition from left to right in placement as well as in the direction that the rhizomes are growing. Next, I added some moss and liverworts to the tank, also known as bryophytes, or affectionately referred to as bryos by the in-crowd. Using tweezers is extremely helpful for this kind of work. I planted small chunks of a variety of bryos throughout the tank. I used only species which would remain tiny and short in height in order to preserve the scale and texture that I wanted for the design. I inserted a small amount of the base of the moss into the clay using sharp, pointed tweezers, which helped hold it in place, especially on vertical and sloping areas. Speaking of bryos, I'm curious which you like better, moss or liverworts. Type your answer in the comments below. This is the tank immediately after planting everything. I forgot to get footage of this, but I used tweezers to insert some Osmocote Plus slow-release fertilizer pellets throughout the plantings. Note how the plants hug the stump and landscape, which preserves the visual flow of the composition. Additionally, as the plantings get farther away from the stump base at either end of the tank and up the stump branches, I gradually used thinner plantings so they taper off gently. This is the tank 4 months after planting. The fern and bryophytes had filled in and began to look more natural. Also, some new mosses began popping up naturally from the substrate. Many species really loved the custom clay mix, and some spread quite rapidly to create colonies across the surface. Ferns, moss, and liverworts also enjoyed growing on the stump, but the higher and more exposed areas require more frequent misting to prevent them from drying out too much. After a lot of careful thought about the design and possibly adding more plants, I decided to try some slightly larger fern species. The bigger fern in this bin is Adiantum ciliatum, a species from China. I put a few small Adiantum around the back of the tank, keeping them behind the hardscape so they wouldn't obstruct the view of the wood and roots. Here are some shots from a month and a half later after things have started to fill in more. There's some dieback of the Microgramma, noticeable as brown and yellow fronds. This was most likely caused by the substrate becoming too wet. The moss and liverworts were creating nice carpets at this point. The liverwort in this pic is a species of Riccardia, one of my favorite genera of bryophytes. Unfortunately, over time the spray foam under the left slope began to collapse slightly, which lowered the lines of the upper corner of the landscape. Additionally, the larger ferns at upper left weren't working for me, both in appearance and also because they obscured the lines of the slope at upper left and made it look even flatter. I decided to revisit the tank layout and figure out how to improve things. For that, I went back to Photoshop for some conceptual prototyping. I used the same Photoshop document that I showed you earlier in this series of videos and added a steeper slope angling upward on the left. This design looked a lot better to me and had the feeling I originally intended. The next steps would unfortunately require me to deconstruct much of the left slope. I pulled all of the roots off the left slope as well as the upper layer of substrate, moss, and microgramma. I also removed the Adiantum from the upper left because, as mentioned a minute ago, I wasn't happy with how they looked, and they weren't happy anyway. I used painter's tape on the glass to approximate the angle I wanted to build up for the rescaping. I didn't want to fill the entire empty space with clay substrate due to its weight and other factors, so I had to find something else to build up the slope first. Spray foam was not an option since the tank already had plants and microfauna, and I was concerned about the gases and chemicals it might release while curing. I decided to use EpiWeb Panel, which is a porous, non-toxic synthetic material made for horticultural use. Using some heavy-duty shears, I cut out multiple shapes of EpiWeb and stacked them in the corner until I felt they made a good foundation. EpiWeb compacts a bit under weight, so I took that into consideration while prototyping it. To secure the EpiWeb in place, I dug the clay base out a bit so the panel section sat snugly in place. Then I started adding some raw clay over the edges and onto the underlying spray foam. I firmly pressed each layer of panel onto the next, ensuring that some of the clay was between them to help strengthen the shape of the slope. When I started adding EpiWeb above the foam foundation, I smeared some wet clay on the panel edges and then pressed them onto the glass in the corner. The process continued as I layered the EpiWeb together, securing it all with clay, then covered the top with a layer of clay to conceal the foundation and build up the slope. Here's the new corner slope. Notice that the clay wraps around the farthest left stump branch. I had to do that to maintain the angle of the slope that I desired, but it's not a bad thing because it looks like the substrate eroded down onto the stump over time. This is what the entire scape looked like after fixing the left side. Note that the combined height and angle of the new slope maintained a straight line with the lower portion going down and to the right. The visual flow and drama of the composition was greatly improved by this change. The next step was to add roots and moss back to the slope. I kept most of the roots positioned similarly to how they were before, which is that they curled around and then pointed downward. However, I decided to place a couple of them going upward. I thought this looked natural and added some variety. In the previous video, I talked about how the roots would not work well going up the slope, but I think just one or two going that way looks good. It would only have been an issue if all of the roots were going up the slope, because that would have had a much stronger impact on the visual flow than just a couple of them. I continued replanting the slope, carefully adding back the original substrate and moss. The grown-in clay had darker, brownish coloration, and I wanted to match that as much as possible over the brighter, fresh substrate, so I tried to spread that clay out to cover as much of the fresh clay as I could. Here's the tank after I replaced part of the substrate and moss layer. I decided to add a different species of plant in the open area before covering up the rest of the slope with grown-in clay and moss. For a while, I'd been thinking of different plant options, but I kept gravitating toward Reldia minutiflora because the size, shape, and appearance were a good match for the design, and that plant tends to grow on shady slopes in the wild, so it would look natural. I grabbed a somewhat mature specimen as well as some leaf cuttings. I sprinkled a thin layer of substrate where the Reldia would be planted, and also ensured that the plant had a good amount of substrate attached to its root ball so it would not be sitting directly on the clay. Then I set the Reldia on the slope and used some U-shaped wire pins to secure it in place, as shown earlier in this video with the Microgramma. I then covered the remaining fresh clay slope around the Reldia with more old clay, moss, and some Microgramma. Here's the tank after the slope was restructured and replanted. I was much happier with this composition and planting, so the hard work and time involved in redoing the layout was worth it. Thankfully, I was able to spread out the grown-in clay, so the fresh clay is mostly hidden. All that remained was to let everything grow back in a bit. About 5 weeks later, the Reldia started blooming, so I thought it was a good time to make some nice images of the tank. I'll talk briefly about the lighting and care for this tank. The light is a NICREW Classic LED Plus in the 18 to 24 inch size. It's connected to a digital timer which gives the tank a 12-hour photo period per day. Sometimes people worry about if a light will be bright enough for their terrarium. The type of tropical plants that I grow are mostly species that do better in low light. In fact, this NICREW is too bright for the Reldia and Microgramma, so I put some shade material over the tank to dim it. I keep the tank sealed and humid, and only occasionally miss the stump area where the Microgramma is a bit drier. If you feel this video was helpful or otherwise worthy, I'd greatly appreciate it if you'd give it a like and then share it with others who'd benefit from it. Also, please consider joining Team Terraria by hitting the subscribe button, then click the bell so you'll get notified when I post a new video.